The morning sky above the Sonoran desert stretched pale and cloudless, the kind of deceptive calm that fooled newcomers into thinking the land was forgiving. Jacob Brennan had learned better over his 17 years crossing Arizona's most unforgiving terrain, hauling specialty goods between remote trading posts that still depended on the old routes. His weathered Ford pickup carried handcrafted Navajo jewelry, medical supplies, and dried dates, 40 pounds of them destined for a co-op in Ajo. The dates sat in burlap sacks behind his seat, their sweet smell mixing with dust and engine oil. He'd left Tucson before dawn on March 3, 1987, when the radio still worked and the forecast called for clear conditions. By noon, static had consumed every frequency. The temperature gauge climbed past 100 degrees as he navigated the dirt track that cut through 60 miles of emptiness between Highway 85 and his destination. This wasn't his usual route. A rock slide had closed the main road 3 days earlier, but Jacob knew these backroads the way some men knew city streets, or so he believed. The first wall of sand appeared at 2:47 p.m., a towering brown curtain that swallowed the horizon. Jacob had seen dust devils and seasonal storms, but nothing like the massive front bearing down on his truck with the speed of a freight train. He accelerated, hoping to outrun it to a rocky outcrop he remembered from previous trips, but the storm moved faster than physics should allow. Within minutes, visibility dropped to zero. The truck's headlights reflected back at him in a blinding orange fog. If you're enjoying this story of survival and determination, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's continue with Jacob's fight for survival. His front tire caught something, a wash he couldn't see, a hidden drop-off, and the steering wheel jerked violently to the right. The truck listed, then rolled, metal screaming against rock as it tumbled twice before slamming to a stop on its passenger side. Jacob's head cracked against the driver's window. Blood trickled warm down his temple as the world spun and settled into a ringing silence, punctuated only by the howl of wind and the tick of cooling metal. When clarity returned, seconds or minutes later, he couldn't tell, sand was already pouring through the shattered windshield. The storm's roar was deafening, a living thing trying to bury him. Jacob pushed against his door, but it was pinned against the ground. The passenger door above him wouldn't budge either, jammed by the impact. Panic flared hot in his chest before training took over. He'd grown up hunting with his grandfather in the White Mountains, had survived a 3-day blizzard at age 14. The first rule was simple: don't waste energy on problems you can't solve immediately. He twisted in the confined space, broken glass cutting through his denim jacket, and kicked at the rear window until it gave way. Sand immediately began filling the truck bed, but the opening was large enough. Jacob squeezed through, dragging his emergency pack and 2 of the date sacks with him. The wind nearly tore him off his feet the moment he emerged. Sand blasted his exposed skin like buckshot, and breathing required covering his mouth with his bandana. The truck was useless now, half buried already and sinking fast. Jacob's mind raced through his options with the cold calculation that separated survivors from statistics. He had maybe 3 minutes of visibility between gusts, enough to see he'd crashed near a small arroyo, a dry wash carved into the desert floor by flash floods. The steep banks offered some protection from the wind. He half slid, half fell into it, clutching his supplies. The arroyo was about 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide, its walls compacted caliche and sandstone that had resisted erosion for centuries. Jacob pressed himself against the leeward wall, where the wind's fury diminished just enough to think. His pack contained basics: 2 water bottles, a tarp, rope, a knife, matches in a waterproof container, and a first aid kit. The dates: each sack held 20 pounds of medjool variety, dense with calories and natural sugars. Food for weeks if rationed properly. But water was another matter entirely. The storm's intensity didn't decrease as afternoon bled into evening. If anything, it strengthened. Jacob had heard about the megastorms that occasionally formed when conditions aligned perfectly or catastrophically across the desert. Old-timers spoke of the 1972 event that had lasted 16 days, burying entire homesteads. He dismissed such stories as exaggeration. Now, huddled in his Arroyo fortress as sand poured over the rim like a waterfall, those tales felt uncomfortably real. As darkness fell, Jacob made his first critical decision. He couldn't stay exposed, even in the Arroyo's relative shelter. The temperature would plummet after sunset, and hypothermia killed as efficiently as dehydration in the desert. Using his knife, he began digging into the Arroyo's northern wall, carving out a shallow cave just large enough for his body. The caliche was hard as concrete near the surface, but softer beneath, almost clay-like. He worked methodically, using a flat rock as a shovel when his hands blistered, piling the excavated material to form a windbreak at the entrance. 3 hours of exhausting labor produced a burrow 4 feet deep and barely wide enough to turn around in. Jacob draped his tarp across the opening, securing it with rocks and sand, creating a crude but effective barrier against the elements. Inside, the howling wind became a muffled roar. The temperature stabilized. He could breathe without inhaling sand with every gulp of air. He allowed himself 3 dates and 4 ounces of water, less than a quarter of 1 bottle. His head throbbed from the crash, and he suspected a mild concussion, but the bleeding had stopped. He cleaned the cut with precious water and bandaged it with strips torn from his spare shirt. Then he forced himself to assess his situation with brutal honesty. Nobody knew exactly where he was. His usual route would have taken him along the highway, not this abandoned track. The trading post in Io expected him yesterday or tomorrow. His schedule was flexible, and delays were common. His ex-wife in Tucson wouldn't worry for at least a week. The storm would erase his tire tracks within hours, and his overturned truck would soon be completely buried. Search and rescue wouldn't even know where to look. The realization settled over him like the sand itself. He was completely alone, and he might be for a very long time. But Jacob Brennan had faced long odds before. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, words spoken during that blizzard 18 years ago. Survival isn't about strength or luck. It's about making good decisions, one after another, until you run out of decisions or you make it home. Jacob closed his eyes and began to plan. He had 40 pounds of dates and perhaps a gallon of water. The storm could last days, maybe a week if he was unlucky. When it finally cleared, he'd be miles from any road, and walking out would mean crossing miles of desert without reliable water sources. His best chance was to shelter in place, conserve everything, and pray that someone eventually came looking. But prayer alone wouldn't keep him alive. He needed a system, a routine that maximized his resources while maintaining the physical and mental discipline to endure whatever came next. As the first night of his ordeal deepened and the storm raged on with undiminished fury, Jacob Brennan began to construct the careful calculations that would determine whether he lived or died in this sandy tomb. The second day began without dawn, just a gradual lightening of the brown haze that penetrated his tarp shelter. Jacob's body ached from sleeping on hard ground, and his mouth felt like it had been stuffed with cotton. He checked his water supply, 3 3/4 bottles remaining. At his current rate, he had perhaps 8 days before dehydration became critical. The dates could sustain him for weeks, but without water, they were useless. The storm hadn't weakened. When Jacob pulled back a corner of the tarp to peer outside, sand immediately blasted into his face. The arroyo had filled by at least a foot overnight, and drifts were building against his shelter. If the accumulation continued at this rate, he'd be buried within days. He needed to dig out regularly, but each venture into the maelstrom cost energy and exposed him to the storm's abrasive fury. He established his first routine: Every 4 hours, he would clear the entrance to his burrow, piling the sand on the opposite wall to build additional protection. The work was exhausting and seemingly futile. The wind immediately began refilling what he'd cleared, but it kept the shelter from being completely sealed. More importantly, it gave him something to do, a structure to his days that kept panic at bay. Rationing became a precise science. Jacob divided his dates into 30 portions, though he prayed he wouldn't need that many. Each portion contained about 1 1/3 pounds, roughly 12 large dates, providing approximately 1,400 calories. Enough to keep his body functioning, but low enough to stretch his supply. Water was trickier. He settled on 12 ounces per day, taken in 4-ounce increments with his date rations. It was below the recommended amount for desert survival, especially with physical exertion, but it was the best compromise he could calculate. By the 3rd day, Jacob's lips had cracked and his urine had darkened to amber. The headache from his concussion had faded, replaced by the constant dull throb of dehydration. He tried to minimize movement, but the claustrophobic burrow made rest impossible. His mind began to wander, replaying memories with vivid intensity. He thought about his daughter, Rebecca, now 11 years old and living in Phoenix with her mother. Their relationship had fractured when he'd chosen the trading routes over a stable job in the city, when his need for open spaces had proven stronger than his need for family dinners and school plays. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, heavier than the sand accumulating above him. He'd been planning to drive to Phoenix next week to surprise Rebecca at her spring soccer game. Now he might never see her again. The isolation was harder than the physical deprivation. Jacob had spent much of his adult life alone on long drives, but this was different. This was the soul-crushing awareness that no human voice would interrupt his thoughts, that no headlights would appear on a distant road. He talked to himself, narrating his actions like a documentary. Now we're clearing the entrance again. Watch how the sand fills in immediately. That's the desert for you. Patient, relentless, always waiting to reclaim what's hers. On the 4th day, the storm's character changed. The wind shifted from its steady westerly assault to chaotic gusts from multiple directions, creating strange acoustic effects in the arroyo. Jacob heard phantom voices, the sound of engines, even music, all tricks of wind moving through rock formations. He knew they weren't real, but the loneliness made him strain to listen anyway, desperate for any connection to the world beyond his sand tomb. He began to modify his shelter, driven partly by necessity and partly by the need to keep his mind occupied. Using his knife and a piece of metal salvaged from his buried truck, he'd tunneled to it briefly during the 3rd day. Though the effort nearly exhausted him, Jacob carved niches into the burrow's walls. He created a storage system for his dates, carefully wrapping them in torn pieces of tarp to protect them from moisture and contamination. He designed a condensation trap using his metal water bottle, hoping to capture any atmospheric humidity, though the method yielded only drops. His hands developed thick calluses, then blisters that burst and reformed as calluses. Every muscle ached from the confined space and constant digging. He developed a rash from the sand that worked its way into every crevice of his clothing. Small cuts became infected despite his efforts to keep them clean, red streaks radiating from wounds that should have been trivial. But he maintained his routine with religious devotion. 4 times daily, clear the entrance, eat his portion of dates, drink his ration of water, check his supplies. Between these tasks, he exercised as much as the cramped space allowed, push-ups, stretches, isometric holds against the burrow walls. He'd read somewhere that captives who maintained physical routines survived longer mentally and physically than those who surrendered to inactivity. The dates became both sustenance and torment. Their sweetness was overwhelming after days of eating nothing else, coating his mouth with sticky residue that intensified his thirst. He tried eating them slowly, letting each one dissolve on his tongue to maximize the psychological satisfaction. But the technique backfired. The extended sweetness made him crave water even more desperately. By the 6th day, Jacob noticed his thinking had slowed. Simple calculations took longer. He found himself staring at the burrow wall for extended periods, his mind blank before snapping back to awareness. Mild dehydration was affecting his cognition, but he couldn't increase his water ration without running out too soon. It was a cruel mathematics. Drink enough to think clearly now and die of thirst later, or accept mental fog as the price of survival. The storm howled on, utterly indifferent to his suffering. Jacob marked each day by carving a line into the burrow wall with his knife. 6 marks now, representing 6 days of imprisonment. He allowed himself to wonder, during his darkest moments, whether he would simply add lines until his water ran out and his hand became too weak to carve anymore. Whether some future archaeologist might find his skeleton in this hand-dug tomb, the wall covered with pathetic tallies of hope, gradually giving way to despair. But then he'd think of Rebecca, of her laugh, and the way she'd hugged him during their last visit, and he'd force himself through another round of entrance clearing, another careful rationing of dates, another sip of water that barely wet his swollen tongue. He was still alive. The storm would end. Someone might come looking. These were the mantras he repeated, the fragile threads of hope that kept him moving through each endless day. On the 7th morning, Jacob noticed something that made his heart skip. The sand that had blown into his shelter overnight was slightly damp. Not wet. The Sonoran Desert didn't do wet, but carrying a faint moisture that darkened its color. He emerged from his burrow into the maelstrom and felt it immediately. The temperature had dropped, and the air carried the electric charge that preceded desert storms. Rain. Somewhere to the west, probably over the mountains, it was raining. The storm was pulling moisture into its circulation. For the first time in a week, Jacob allowed himself a genuine smile. Rain in the desert was unpredictable and often dangerous. Flash floods could fill an arroyo in minutes, turning it from shelter to death trap. But it also meant water. If he could capture even a fraction of it, he might extend his survival window from days to weeks. He spent the entire day preparing, working with feverish energy despite his weakened state. Using every piece of fabric he could spare, his spare shirt, the bandana, strips of tarp, he created a water collection system. He dug shallow channels in the arroyo floor, leading to a depression he'd carved out and lined with the tarp's waterproof surface. He positioned his metal water bottle to catch any direct rainfall. It was crude, probably inefficient, but it was something. The rain arrived that night with shocking violence. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning illuminated the arroyo in strobing flashes. Water fell not in drops, but in sheets, instantly overwhelming Jacob's collection system. Within minutes, the arroyo began to fill. He retreated to his burrow, watching in horror as muddy water surged through the arroyo, rising toward his shelter's entrance. The flash flood peaked at about 2 feet deep, lapping at his burrow's threshold, before receding almost as quickly as it had risen. Jacob's heart pounded as he realized how close he'd come to drowning in his shelter. But when the water drained and he emerged to assess the damage, he found his collection basin had captured nearly a quart of muddy water. Combined with what his bottle had caught and what he could wring from his soaked fabric strips, he had perhaps a half-gallon of contaminated but drinkable water. He spent hours filtering it through layers of cloth, letting the sediment settle, carefully transferring the clearest portions to his bottles. The water tasted like minerals and earth, but it was salvation. His mental fog lifted slightly. His cracked lips began to heal. For the first time since the crash, Jacob dared to believe he might actually survive this ordeal. But survival required more than water. The rain had changed the storm's dynamics, compacting the sand and making it harder to dig through. His burrow's walls had partially collapsed, requiring extensive repairs. And the storm itself showed no signs of ending. If anything, the introduction of moisture had energized it, creating a churning chaos of wind, sand, and occasional rain that seemed more dangerous than the dry onslaught that had preceded it. Jacob reinforced his shelter, working methodically despite his exhaustion. He was thinner now, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost 15 pounds. His hands shook slightly even when at rest, but he was still alive, still fighting, still making good decisions, one after another. And as he carved the 7th mark into his burrow wall, he allowed himself to think it might not be his last. The storm's second week brought challenges that tested not just Jacob's physical endurance, but his sanity. The intermittent rains continued, sometimes brief sprinkles, occasionally violent deluges that threatened to flood his shelter. His water situation had improved dramatically. He'd collected enough to refill all his bottles and had even begun taking slightly larger rations. But the psychological toll of confinement was mounting. He talked constantly now, holding elaborate conversations with imaginary companions. Sometimes it was his grandfather, offering survival advice in that gravelly voice Jacob remembered from childhood. Other times it was Rebecca, and he'd tell her about the desert, about the strange beauty of a sandstorm viewed from inside its heart, about the lessons he was learning. He knew these conversations weren't real, but they helped structure his thoughts and kept the silence from becoming absolute. On day 10, Jacob made a disturbing discovery. While clearing sand from his entrance, a task that had become increasingly Sisyphean as the drifts grew higher, he found a dead coyote buried in the accumulation. The animal had apparently sought shelter in the arroyo during the storm and suffocated under the sand. Its presence unnerved him deeply. He was looking at his own potential fate, a creature killed by the same forces trying to bury him, but the coyote also represented an opportunity. Jacob had been raised to use every resource the desert provided, and while the idea disgusted him, protein was protein. He skinned the animal with his knife, gagging at the smell, and cut strips of meat that he attempted to preserve by drying them in the sporadic sunshine that occasionally broke through the storm. Most of the meat spoiled before it could dry properly, but he managed to save enough for several meals. A welcome break from the relentless sweetness of dates. The variety helped, but his body was deteriorating despite the improved water supply. His gums had started bleeding, suggesting scurvy from vitamin deficiencies. His joints ached constantly, and he'd developed a persistent cough from inhaling fine sand particles. Sleep became increasingly difficult, interrupted by vivid dreams that blurred with waking reality. During his 14th night, Jacob experienced what he later recognized as a hallucination, but felt utterly real at the time. He heard his truck's engine starting, heard voices calling his name. He crawled out of his burrow into the storm, screaming responses, digging frantically toward where he thought the sounds originated. He tunneled through sand for hours, convinced rescue was mere feet away, until exhaustion and returning clarity made him realize he'd been pursuing phantoms. The episode terrified him. He'd lost perhaps 4 hours to the delusion, had wasted precious energy, and had nearly become disoriented enough to lose his shelter entirely. Afterward, he instituted a new rule. He would not leave his burrow at night, no matter what he heard or thought he heard. The darkness played tricks, and his mind was no longer entirely trustworthy. By day 16, Jacob had consumed half his dates and was down to his last week of rations, even with strict discipline. The storm had decreased in intensity, but hadn't stopped. It had settled into a steady, grinding persistence that felt worse than the violent early days. At least dramatic winds suggested the storm had energy to burn through. This endless, moderate assault felt like it could continue forever. He'd developed routines within routines, tiny rituals that gave structure to identical days. He would count his dates in the morning, arranging them by size. He'd exercise at the same times each day, measuring his diminishing strength against yesterday's performance. He'd carve elaborate designs into the burrow walls, creating a record of his imprisonment that was part calendar, part art, part desperate assertion that he existed and mattered. The water collection system had become sophisticated through trial and error. He'd learned to predict when rains were coming by the smell of the air and the behavior of the wind. He'd created a multi-stage filtration system using sand, cloth, and charcoal from his precious matches. He could now produce water that was almost clear, though it retained a mineral taste that reminded him he was drinking the desert itself. On day 19, something changed. Jacob woke to a different quality of silence, not the absence of wind, but a shift in its voice. The howling had dropped from a scream to a moan. When he ventured out to clear his entrance, he noticed the sand wasn't flying horizontally anymore, but falling at angles, and occasional patches of actual sky, not brown but pale blue, appeared between gusts. Hope surged so powerfully it made him dizzy. The storm was weakening. After 19 days of relentless assault, the desert was finally releasing its grip. But Jacob forced himself to temper his excitement with caution. He'd seen too many false endings, too many moments when conditions seemed to improve before deteriorating again. He would maintain his routines, conserve his resources, and prepare for the storm's end rather than celebrate prematurely. That night, he allowed himself a small luxury. He ate an extra date and drank an additional ounce of water. He used some of his precious water to wash his face and hands, removing layers of grime that had become so familiar he'd stopped noticing them. He looked at his reflection in his metal water bottle's polished surface and barely recognized the gaunt, bearded stranger staring back. The next morning, the storm had diminished further. Jacob could now see across the arroyo to the opposite wall, could make out details of rock formations and sand patterns. The wind still blew, but at survivable speeds. For the first time in nearly 3 weeks, he could stand upright outside his shelter without being immediately blasted off his feet. He climbed out of the arroyo, a feat that required careful navigation of sand drifts that had transformed the landscape into something alien. The desert stretched in every direction, sculpted into dunes and ridges that bore no resemblance to the terrain he remembered. His truck was completely buried. He could see only the faintest outline of where it might be, a slight depression in the sand. Navigation would be nearly impossible. Every landmark he'd known was hidden or altered. But Jacob had one advantage. Before the crash, he'd been traveling roughly northeast. If he could determine direction using the sun and stars, if he could maintain a straight line, he should eventually intersect either the highway or the trading post. It might take days of walking through soft sand with minimal supplies, but it was possible. That night, stars appeared for the first time in 3 weeks. Jacob sat on the edge of his burrow and stared upward, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The constellations had never looked so beautiful, so reassuring in their familiar patterns. He identified Orion, used it to find north, and began planning his route. But he wouldn't leave immediately. The storm might return, and he needed to rest, to build up his strength for the journey ahead. He had perhaps 12 days of dates remaining, and now had abundant water from the recent rains. He would spend 2 more days in his shelter, exercising progressively harder, eating slightly larger portions, preparing his body for the final ordeal. On day 21, Jacob took inventory of everything he would carry. His pack, now much lighter without the water weight, his knife, his matches, a selection of dates. He fashioned a crude hat from the tarp to protect against the sun. He filled every container with water, and he carved one final message into his burrow wall. Jacob Brennan survived 21 days. March 1987. Going home. The next morning, with the storm reduced to occasional gusts and the sky mostly clear, Jacob Brennan emerged from his burrow for the last time, shouldered his pack, and began walking northeast into a transformed desert that offered no guarantees, but at least offered possibility. The desert that Jacob walked through bore little resemblance to the one he'd known. The storm had rearranged the landscape into surreal geometries. Sand dunes crested where flat ground had been, familiar washes were now filled canyons, and the sparse vegetation that normally dotted the terrain was either buried or stripped bare. He felt like an astronaut exploring an alien planet, navigating by dead reckoning and hope. His plan was simple: walk during the cooler morning and evening hours, rest during the brutal midday heat, and maintain a northeastern heading using the sun's position and the North Star at night. He estimated he'd covered 10 miles from the highway when he crashed, so returning should theoretically take 2 or 3 days of steady walking. But theoretical meant little in terrain this altered, and his weakened condition made even simple walking exhausting. The first day of his journey, Jacob managed perhaps 4 miles before exhaustion forced him to stop. His legs, weakened by 3 weeks of inactivity, trembled and threatened to collapse. He'd lost so much muscle mass that his body struggled with basic locomotion. He found shelter beneath an overhanging rock formation and rationed himself carefully. 4 dates, 8 ounces of water. The dates tasted different out here, under open sky instead of in his cramped burrow. Better, but also tinged with anxiety. Each one consumed was one less in reserve. That night, temperatures plummeted below freezing, and Jacob shivered violently despite wrapping himself in the tarp. He'd forgotten how cold desert nights could be, how the same environment that baked you during the day could kill you with cold when the sun set. He did jumping jacks until his heart pounded, then huddled in the fetal position, counting the hours until dawn. The second day brought a cruel discovery. At mid-morning, Jacob crested a large dune and saw in the distance what looked like the highway, a dark line cutting across the desert floor. Joy flooded through him. He was closer than he'd estimated. He increased his pace, stumbling down the dune and across the flats, ignoring his body's protests. But as he approached, the highway revealed itself to be a geological formation, a band of dark volcanic rock that crossed the desert in a perfectly straight line. Not a road, not rescue, just another trick of the desert, another disappointment to crush his spirit. Jacob sat down hard, fighting despair. He'd wasted energy on false hope, had pushed too hard, and now felt dangerously lightheaded. He forced himself to rest, to drink water, to recalibrate his expectations. The desert didn't care about his hopes or his suffering. It simply was. Getting angry at it accomplished nothing. He noticed as he rested that his hands had developed a pronounced tremor. His vision occasionally blurred at the edges. These were warning signs of severe dehydration despite his water intake, symptoms of electrolyte imbalance from weeks of inadequate nutrition. The dates provided calories but lacked the minerals and vitamins his body desperately needed. He was surviving, but barely, and the margin between survival and collapse was narrowing with each passing hour. On the third day of walking, Jacob's progress slowed to less than a mile. His feet had developed massive blisters that burst and bled into his boots. Each step was agony. He'd developed a hacking cough that brought up phlegm tinged with blood, evidence of damage to his lungs from breathing sand for so long. His thoughts fragmented, jumping between present and past, between determination and surrender. He thought about just stopping, about lying down in the sand and letting the desert take him. It would be easy, peaceful even. No more pain, no more struggle. But each time the thought surfaced, he'd see Rebecca's face, would remember his promise to attend her soccer game, and he'd force himself to take another step, then another. That afternoon, delirious from exhaustion and heat, Jacob saw a figure in the distance. A person, definitely a person, walking toward him. He tried to call out, but his voice was a raspy whisper. He waved his arms. The figure didn't respond, just kept walking at an odd angle that didn't quite intersect his position. As the distance closed, Jacob realized it was a mirage. Not a person, but a saguaro cactus, its arms extended in a way that suggested human form, distorted by heat, shimmer into apparent movement. He'd been pursuing another phantom, but the cactus was real, and where saguaros grew, there was sometimes water deep underground. It was something, a small landmark in the featureless waste. He sheltered in the cactus's shadow during the worst heat, conserving energy, sipping water with disciplined slowness. His supply was running low again. He'd been drinking more than planned, his body's demands overriding his careful rationing. At his current rate, he had perhaps 2 days of water left, maybe 3 if he cut his ration to dangerous levels. Night fell, and Jacob couldn't summon the energy to continue. He'd walked perhaps 7 or 8 miles total over 3 days, a pathetic distance that under normal circumstances he could have covered in a few hours. But these weren't normal circumstances, and he wasn't a normal traveler. He was a skeleton animated by stubbornness and the fading hope that the next rise might reveal salvation. The 4th day of walking began with a gift. Jacob woke at dawn to find dew condensed on the tarp he'd used as a blanket. Not much, but he carefully collected every drop, wringing the fabric into his mouth. It was perhaps 2 ounces total, but those 2 ounces felt like a sign that the universe hadn't completely abandoned him. He walked through morning in a semi-conscious state, his mind departing his body to float somewhere above and behind, observing this struggling figure with detached curiosity. He'd entered the zone that ultra-marathon runners described, where pain became background noise and movement became automatic. Whether this was transcendence or simply advanced deterioration, he couldn't say. Around noon, something changed. Jacob's nose, nearly destroyed by weeks of breathing sand and dry air, caught a scent. Gasoline. Faint, but unmistakable. He stopped, turning slowly, trying to locate the source. There, to his right, slightly north of his current heading. The smell was real, not imagined. Gasoline meant vehicles, meant people, meant roads. He adjusted course, following his nose like a bloodhound, stumbling over his own feet in his haste. The scent grew stronger. Then he heard something that made his heart nearly stop, the distant sound of an engine, the whine of tires on pavement. Jacob topped a low rise, and there, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, was the highway. Actual asphalt, actual road, the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And approaching from the south, a vehicle, a truck by the sound of it. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He managed a shambling jog, waving his arms, croaking out sounds that were supposed to be shouts. The truck was getting closer. It would pass his position in seconds. If the driver didn't see him, if they were looking at the road instead of the desert, he'd miss his chance. Jacob pulled off his shirt despite the sun's brutal heat and waved it like a flag, a bright blue beacon against the tan landscape. His voice finally found strength, screaming, "Help!" loud enough to hurt his damaged throat. The truck's brake lights flared red. It slowed, stopped, then reversed. A door opened and a man climbed out, a rancher based on his clothes, staring at the apparition stumbling toward him from the waist. "Jesus Christ," the man said, his voice thick with shock. "Are you Jacob Brennan?" Jacob could only nod, his voice failing again now that he no longer needed it. His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed to his knees on the highway's shoulder. "We've been searching for you," the rancher continued, rushing forward with a water bottle. "Your ex-wife reported you missing 12 days ago. Search and rescue's been combing the area, but that storm, everyone figured you were gone." Jacob took the water bottle with shaking hands. 24 days, he managed to whisper. "I survived 24 days. The hospital in Tucson became Jacob's world for the next 10 days. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, exposure, infected wounds, possible pneumonia from aspirated sand particles. The doctors recited his conditions with clinical precision, their expressions oscillating between professional concern and barely concealed amazement that he was alive at all. Rebecca visited every day, sitting beside his bed and holding his hand, while tears streamed down her young face. His ex-wife Jennifer came too, her anger at his lifestyle choices temporarily eclipsed by relief. "You stupid, stubborn man," she said, but her voice was soft, almost affectionate. The story of his survival spread quickly through the local news, then regional, then national. "Desert trader survives month-long sandstorm," read one headline. "Arizona man's 24-day ordeal," read another. Reporters wanted interviews, but Jacob found he couldn't talk about it yet. The experience was too raw, too close. He needed distance before he could transform it into narrative. Search and rescue teams were particularly interested in his techniques. The burrow design, the water collection system, the strict rationing protocol, these became case studies in desert survival training. Jacob met with the team leader who'd been searching for him, a weathered woman named Patricia Vasquez, who'd spent 2 weeks coordinating aerial and ground searches across 100 square miles. "The storm was unprecedented," she explained, showing him satellite imagery. "It was a perfect confluence of weather systems, moisture from the Gulf, high-pressure systems colliding, temperature gradients. The meteorologists are calling it a 100-year event. At its peak, it covered 200 square miles with sustained winds, over 60 miles per hour. We had 4 other people go missing, but—" She paused, her expression grave. "You were the only one we found alive." The weight of that information settled heavily on Jacob. Others had died while he'd survived. Random chance, or his grandfather's training, or stubborn refusal to quit. Whatever the reason, he'd been granted life, while others had not. It felt less like blessing and more like responsibility. His recovery was slow and complicated. His lungs would need months to heal from the particulate damage. The malnutrition had weakened his bones, making them prone to stress fractures. His kidney function was compromised from the extended dehydration, and the psychological effects were unpredictable. He experienced occasional panic attacks in enclosed spaces, found himself hoarding water bottles, couldn't sleep without checking and rechecking his surroundings for potential threats. A therapist helped him process the trauma. 24 days of solitary confinement in life-threatening conditions, the therapist noted. That's essentially a form of torture. The fact that you emerged with your sanity intact is remarkable. But Jacob didn't feel remarkable. He felt hollowed out, changed in ways he couldn't articulate. The man who'd driven into that storm was gone, buried under the sand along with his old certainties about who he was and what mattered. 3 weeks after his rescue, Jacob finally returned to the crash site with a recovery team. They'd located his truck using ground-penetrating radar, and now excavators were digging it out. He watched the sand being cleared away layer by layer, revealing the twisted metal that had been both his prison and his salvation. "There it is," one of the workers called out. "Your shelter." They'd exposed his burrow, the hand-carved cave that had kept him alive. Jacob approached it slowly, peering into the darkness. It looked impossibly small, a rabbit hole in the desert. How had he survived 21 days in that cramped space? Looking at it now, from the outside, it seemed like an act of madness rather than survival. But there on the wall were his marks, the careful tally of days. And there was the elaborate carving he'd made during his last night. The words he'd left for whoever might find his bones. Jacob Brennan, survived 21 days, March 1987. Going home. Patricia Vasquez stood beside him, studying the burrow with professional interest. "The soil composition analysis shows you dug almost 6 feet into the arroyo wall," she said, "with just a knife and your hands. That's That's remarkable engineering under extreme duress. It was all I could do, Jacob replied quietly. Just keep making the next decision. Dig a little deeper, ration a little more carefully, wait one more day. They recovered his remaining dates, 8 of them, carefully wrapped and preserved in his improvised storage niche. The workers wanted to discard them, but Jacob insisted on taking them home. They represented his margin of survival, the thin line between life and death. He would keep them as a reminder. His truck was totaled, unsalvageable. The insurance company cut him a check, but noted that without the cargo recovery, the Navajo jewelry had been ruined by moisture and sand. He'd lost significant income. Money concerns that had seemed so important before the storm now felt trivial. He was alive. Everything else was negotiable. Rebecca's soccer game had long since passed, but Jacob attended her next one and the one after that, and everyone through the rest of the season. He found himself unable to take the simple act of watching his daughter play for granted anymore. Each game was a gift, an experience he'd nearly forfeited. Jennifer noticed the change in him. "You're different," she said one afternoon, while dropping Rebecca off. "Quieter, more present." "I died out there," Jacob said, surprising himself with the admission. "Or the version of me that drove into that storm died. I'm still figuring out who came back." 6 months later, Jacob sold his trading route to a younger man eager for the independence of the road. He took a job with search and rescue, using his intimate knowledge of the Sonoran Desert to help locate others who'd become lost in its expanse. The pay was less than he'd made trading, but money had stopped being his primary currency. He moved closer to Phoenix, close enough for regular visits with Rebecca. Their relationship slowly rebuilt itself on more solid foundations. Not the grand gestures he'd once favored, but the steady presence of showing up week after week for the small moments that constituted life. The nightmares continued for years. Dreams of being buried alive, of running out of water with salvation just beyond reach, of walking forever through a landscape that never changed. But they gradually decreased in frequency and intensity, becoming manageable rather than debilitating. 3 years after his ordeal, Jacob received a request from the National Park Service. They wanted him to help design survival guidelines for hikers and travelers in the southwestern deserts, drawing on his experience. He accepted, finding unexpected purpose in transforming his suffering into practical knowledge that might save others. The guidelines were comprehensive, based not just on his experience, but on extensive research into desert survival. Proper preparation, communication protocols, shelter construction, water conservation. The document covered every aspect of staying alive in one of North America's most unforgiving environments. But the introduction Jacob wrote was personal, drawn from the core of what he'd learned. Survival isn't about being the strongest or the most prepared. It's about maintaining hope when hope seems foolish. It's about making good decisions even when you're terrified and exhausted. It's about understanding that the desert doesn't care about your plans or your prayers, so you must care enough for both of you. Most importantly, it's about having something worth surviving for. A daughter's soccer game, a promise to keep, a future you refuse to surrender. The Park Service edited his introduction, calling it too emotional for official guidelines. But Jacob kept the original version, sharing it instead at survival training workshops he began teaching. The workshops attracted diverse participants: hikers, guides, adventure travelers, anyone who worked in or explored desert environments. He became known not for his ordeal, but for his practical, grounded approach to emergency situations. No heroics, no masculine posturing, just calm assessment of problems and methodical application of solutions. Students appreciated his honesty about fear, about the moments when he'd nearly given up, about the unglamorous reality of survival that had nothing to do with action movie scenarios. Rebecca graduated high school, then college, studying environmental science with a focus on desert ecosystems. Jacob attended both graduations, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched her accept her diplomas. She'd been his North Star during those dark days underground, the reason he'd kept counting dates and rationing water when every instinct screamed to just eat and drink what he wanted in his final hours. On the 10-year anniversary of his rescue, Rebecca organized a small ceremony at the site of his survival. The burrow had long since collapsed, filled in by subsequent storms, but they'd placed a modest memorial marker identifying the location. Rebecca, now a confident young woman of 21, read from her father's original survival introduction, the one the Park Service had rejected. "You taught me that survival isn't passive," she said, looking at Jacob with eyes that held both pride and old fear. "You didn't just wait to be saved. You fought for every day, made every decision count. That's how I've tried to live my life, not just enduring, but actively choosing to survive and thrive." The ceremony was attended by Patricia Vasquez, now retired from search and rescue, but still passionate about desert safety. Several of Jacob's survival training students came, along with journalists who'd covered his original story and wanted to mark the anniversary. But the most surprising attendee was the rancher who'd found Jacob on the highway that April morning in 1987. Tom Henderson had driven down from his ranch specifically for the occasion, bringing with him something he'd kept for a decade, the blue shirt Jacob had waved as a signal that day. "I washed it and kept it," Tom said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Figured it was lucky, you know. A man who survived what you survived, his shirt should mean something." They laughed and shook hands. Then Tom added more quietly, "I've stopped for every person I've seen on the roadside since that day. Every single one. You never know when someone's fighting for their life." That evening, as the small group dispersed and Rebecca drove him back to Phoenix, Jacob found himself reflecting on the unexpected legacy of his ordeal. He hadn't set out to inspire anyone or teach lessons. He'd simply refused to die when dying would have been easier. But somehow that stubbornness had rippled outward, touching lives in ways he was still discovering. The dates from his survival, the 8 remaining ones he'd kept all these years, sat in a sealed container in his home office, dried to rock hardness, but preserved. Rebecca had once asked why he kept them, what purpose they served now. "They remind me," he'd answered, "that survival is measured in small units. Not grand gestures or heroic moments, but individual dates eaten, ounces of water rationed, hours endured. When you're facing something impossible, you break it down into the possible, and you tackle that, one date at a time, one decision at a time, until you make it home." Rebecca had nodded, understanding. She'd grown up watching her father's gradual transformation from the restless trader who'd driven into that storm to the grounded present man who now made every moment count. The desert had nearly killed him, but paradoxically, it had also taught him how to truly live. Jacob's story became part of Southwestern survival lore, taught in wilderness training courses and recounted around campfires. The specifics varied in the retellings. Sometimes the storm lasted longer, sometimes his trials were more dramatic, sometimes the rescue was more cinematic. But the core truth remained constant. A man faced with impossible odds had made a series of good decisions, had rationed his resources with painful discipline, and had ultimately prevailed through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The real lesson, Jacob would say when asked, wasn't about survival techniques or desert preparedness, though those mattered. It was about understanding that every human being possessed reservoirs of strength they'd never accessed because they'd never needed to. Desperation revealed capabilities that comfort kept hidden. "The desert taught me," he'd tell his students, "that the limits you think you have aren't real. They're just the boundaries you've accepted without testing them. When survival becomes non-negotiable, When quitting isn't an option because someone you love needs you to come home, you discover you can endure far more than you believed possible. 15 years after his ordeal, Jacob stood in front of a new group of wilderness trainees, this time at a facility in Utah. Rebecca stood at the back of the room, now working as a desert ecologist and occasionally guest lecturing in her father's courses. She smiled as he began his presentation with the same words he always used. "My name is Jacob Brennan, and 28 years ago I survived 24 days in a desert sandstorm by digging burrows and rationing dates. I'm going to tell you how I did it, but more importantly, I'm going to tell you why. Because survival isn't about techniques. It's about understanding what you're surviving for." The room full of eager students leaned forward, ready to learn. And Jacob, older now but still carrying the desert in his bones and the memory of those 24 days carved into his soul, began to teach them about resilience, resourcefulness, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender when everything else has been taken away, except the choice to keep breathing. Outside, the Utah desert stretched toward distant horizons, beautiful and deadly in equal measure, waiting patiently as it always did for the next person who would test themselves against its ancient indifference and discover what they were truly made of when everything else was stripped away.